privileged to introduce Dr. Jonathan Schachter. Dr. Jonathan Schachter, who's a senior fellow with the Hudson Institute Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East. We first met Jonathan when he was an advisor to former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. His portfolio at the time included U.S.-Israel relations, the Iran nuclear deal, and Israel diaspora affairs. He concluded his tenure by serving on the team tasked with exposing materials from Iran's nuclear archive in 2018. And hopefully at some point he'll tell us that story. Since leaving the Prime Minister's office, Jonathan has briefed countless CUFI groups in Jerusalem. Out of all of these meetings and briefings that I've been in with Jonathan, I have to admit that my favorite was in November 2019 when he briefed the CUFI Major League Baseball Tour. My son, 11 at the time and very, very shy, raised his hand and asked Jonathan about the Iron Dome's ability to protect Israel from an Iranian nuclear bomb. The seriousness and care in which he answered Aiden's question will forever stay with me. So thank you, Jonathan, joining us today.
Thank you.
It is also my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonathan Schanzer. To be clear, we had to go to the fourth letter of their names to figure out who was alphabetically first. So Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, the Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Jonathan previously worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Department of Treasury, where he played an integral role in the designation of numerous terrorist financiers. He testifies before Congress often and is widely seen across our television screens. Jonathan has been a friend to CUFI for so long that we have seen his triplets go from toddlers to teenagers. Jonathan, thank you for sharing knowledge and insights with us through all these years. Thank you for being here. So, several times today it's been mentioned from the stage that President Biden was just in Israel and Saudi Arabia. We would love your unvarnished perspective of what this trip was about and what it accomplished.
Am I going to reverse alphabetical order?
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So Jonathan and I just actually had an opportunity to chat about this on Friday. And, well, we have, I think, a couple of differing views, but we may be on the same page, at least mostly on the same page. The first thing that I'll just say about this trip, I give the president high marks. Not for everything that happened, and we can get into the good and the bad and the ugly, but my favorite thing about this visit was that the squad and Bernie Sanders have smoke coming out of their ears right now, that President Biden went to Israel and went to Saudi Arabia and restored friendships that should be strong. And for that, I think the president should get high marks.
So I was trying to figure, there was all these articles and analyses of the president's trip before the trip. And I was trying to figure out myself why he was going. And I think, before the trip, I thought he was probably going to try and check a box on the Israel side and check a box on the Palestinian side. And then there was the gas issue and a couple other things. But I agree with Jonathan in that after the first day of the visit in Israel, I felt that he had actually sort of doubled down against the progressive wing of the party that everyone had thought that he was going to try to placate. So I give the president credit for doing that because I think that's important. For me, I don't get past the much bigger issue, which for me is the nuclear issue. So I say, I'm glad he did that. I give him credit for doing that. But I think on the nuclear issue, the visit was very disturbing for me. And so it's hard for me to get past that.
Can you elaborate on that a little more? We're hearing reports that the UAE is contemplating putting their ambassador back in Tehran. So what do you think the implications are for the UAE and their neighbors in regard to this trip?
I think that I saw a report today about the Saudis are meeting with Iran. These things are completely consistent with my concern. That is, I think the countries of the Gulf, the UAE, the Saudis, others, they're concerned about where the U.S. is. And so what they're doing is they're hedging their bets. So they're working with each other more closely. They're working with Israel more closely. And you see them also reaching out to Iran to hedge their bets. Now, the difference between the Gulf countries and Israel, with all the cooperation, all the progress that's been made, Israel can't hedge its bets. Israel can bet on the United States, it can work with the Gulf countries, and it can rely on itself. But Israel can't reach out to Tehran and say, hey, let's see, maybe we can work something out. And so I think these reports about the UAE, by the way, you see this across the region. You see reports about the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Turks and the Syrians, and everyone is talking with each other now in a way that they haven't for quite a while, and I think it's because of the perception that the U.S. isn't there and as reliable as it's been in the past.
Well, look, I would say that it's no surprise that the Gulf states, whether it's the UAE, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, they're all going to hedge. These are weak powers. These are not particularly strong governments. They're afraid of what their own people think about their relationship with Israel or the United States, for that matter. They're afraid of getting bombed by Iran, justifiably. What I would say, though, is that military cooperation and that diplomatic activity is happening regardless. Regardless of what is being signaled out of Abu Dhabi or out of Riyadh, we know that there are conversations that are happening with the help of CENTCOM, Central Command, our primary sort of arm of the U.S. military in the Middle East. There are these ongoing discussions. There's an architecture that is being built, and yes, Israel is going to be at the center of it because of Israel's prowess on the battlefield, because of Israel's high technology. All of these things, I think, are very positive. And I would also note that all of these Arab states, they fear Iran much more than they ever hated Israel. And so they continue to look to Israel as this really surprising power in the region. I mean, one of the things, it's not even a secret anymore. There is a war that is going on across the Middle East almost every night. The Israelis call it the war between wars, or the campaign between wars. These are the attacks that you see when things blow up on the airfield in Damascus. This is what you see when there's a cyber attack inside Iran, or Iranian drones are destroyed as they're sitting on the airfield. The Israelis have been eating the lunch of the Iranians for 7, 8, 9 years. This is a war, okay? And the Arab states know it, and they love it. And that's why we continue to see this cooperation, regardless of how it's framed by the Emirates, by the Saudis, or even by the United States. The train has left the building, folks. The Arabs know that they need Israel.
Thank you for the encouragement. So thank you for moving to Israel's northern front. A couple questions here. One is Israel's de facto northern neighbor, Russia. So how does Israel thread this needle in this complicated situation? And what do you expect in the evolution of the conflicts with Ukraine and the evolution in Israel's relationship with Russia?
So in 2015, you see, not coincidentally, just a couple of months after the conclusion of the Iran nuclear deal, you see the large-scale deployment of Russian forces in Syria. And the Prime Minister very quickly took a trip to Moscow. And the reason he did that was because Israel had a policy that it evolved over time, but it started with the beginning of the Syrian civil war. And it had a series of red lines. It talked about not allowing the Golan Heights to be used as a terror front against Israel, not allowing Syria to be used for the transfer of major weapon systems to Hezbollah, and that Israel would also respond to fire from Syria regardless of whose it was or whether it was intentional. Now you've got a problem. because Israel kept its red lines, but now you have the Russian military on the ground and the Russian Air Force in the sky, in the same small space. So the Prime Minister went and he met with Putin, and they worked out an arrangement for what they call deconfliction. And the purpose of this arrangement was to make sure that Israeli aircraft and Russian aircraft wouldn't crash into each other and wouldn't shoot each other down. We would meet with senators and congressmen in Jerusalem. They would come and say, what's this close relationship you have with Russia? What's going on? Russia's the, right? They say Russia's the enemy, so how can this be? Explain. As you said, Russia is across, the Russian army, the Russian Air Force is across the street. It's not hundreds of miles away, it's 10 miles away. When you explained this consideration, which was critical to Israel's national security, they understood. So we get it, right? It was a practical relationship from the start, but a very important one. And I think with the start of the war in Ukraine, people began to ask questions again. Because Israel's in a precarious position, because the war in Syria, the Iranian effort to entrench itself permanently in Syria as a front, a forward position to launch attacks on Israel, that's their explicit goal, right? This isn't analysis, they've said this, right? Remains a primary Israeli national security concern. So Israel finds itself in the position where it has to get along with Russia in order to address this major national security concern without hugging Russia too closely at a time when Russia is invading Ukraine. It's very difficult. I think the Israelis have tried to, like you said, thread that needle. Depending on who you ask and what their predisposition is toward Israel, they'll tell you that it's been more or less successful.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all of that. I would just maybe add a couple of additional thoughts. One is that, a lot of people have talked about this relationship between Israel and Russia as warm. It is not warm. It is professional. And that's the way I've heard every senior Israeli official describe it, that Israel, when they go to the Kremlin, these meetings they're not tense, but they're very matter of fact. And it's basically the Israelis not asking for permission to strike certain assets in Syria, but telling the Russians that they are going to do it and that they expect the Russians to stand down. And the only sort of comedy that I've ever heard, or any warmness coming out of these meetings, is actually Putin at the end of the meetings suggesting to Israelis that, I see you flying these American-made F-16s. Why don't you try one of my Sukhois? I promise you they're going to be better than right? And so it's like there's an attempt to try to maybe break the ice, but the Israelis are not having any of it. Now, after the war began, I actually, my last trip to Israel, I just went 2 weeks ago, but before that, I actually landed in Israel on the day that the war began in Ukraine. And I had expected actually to be in Israel talking about a range of other issues, and all we ended up talking about was Russia and Ukraine. And the Israelis were actually very upset with the United States, because the United States was not recognizing everything that Israel was doing, shuttling back and forth. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett was running back and forth, trying to get Putin to dial back on his word with Ukraine. He was trying to get him to think twice about everything that he had just started. And he actually flew on Shabbat, which was a major issue for Naftali Bennett. This is a deeply religious man who never would have done that unless he believed that he could potentially save lives. Now, what I find interesting is I think the Israelis have finally shown everyone that they are on the right side of this conflict. They voted at the UN against Russia. They've continued to provide all sorts of assistance to the Ukrainian military. And they've opened up actually their largest field hospital ever on the border of Ukraine and Poland. And so there's a lot that Israel's been doing to try to alleviate the suffering. And I actually even saw it was sort of a thrift shop inside the mall in Jerusalem, right next to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at Cinema City, where there were Ukrainian refugees that were coming in and trying on, they were shopping for clothes that had been donated by Israelis from all over Jerusalem. And you get this just incredible feeling that, you know, you have everyday Israelis that were doing everything they could to try to help absorb these Ukrainian immigrants. But the thing that I think about right now is the fact that we've just learned, Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, just announced that Iran is providing drones to Russia to fuel its war effort. Now, this just cannot be stressed enough that the Iranians and the Russians are allies, right? They are part of a new axis that is growing. And the insane thing that I think we all need to think about right now is, why are we still pursuing an Iran nuclear deal that would provide Iran with billions and billions of dollars so that they could continue to contribute to the Russian war effort, which is continuing to provide it's spurring on the energy crisis that we have right now, the pain that we feel at the pump. And you know what the apologists for the Iran deal are saying right now is, we need to get back into the Iran deal so that we can get Iran to pump more energy. I just don't get it any longer. But really, we need to remember at the end of the day that Russia and Iran are on the same side, and that puts America and Israel on the other side. And that's a good place to be.
Amen. So staying on the northern border and just moving a little bit further to the east, let's talk about, to the west. Let's talk about Lebanon. Estimates of how many rockets Hezbollah potentially has aimed at Israel and how deeply we should be concerned.
A lot and deeply.
Would you care to elaborate?
So I was always told to be concise. I don't know the exact current number of missiles and rockets.
180,000.
180,000. So you can say that Jonathan knew. So 180,000. There are two problems. One of these is quantitative. 180,000 rockets and missiles is a lot of rockets and missiles. The other problem is qualitative. And increasingly, Hezbollah, and of course, it's critical to remember a couple of things. I want to take a step back here, just a word about Iran. Remember, Israel and Iran, they don't share a border. There's no territorial conflict between them. Before 1979, the two countries were partners and allies, right? I saw pictures in pre-revolution Iran, in Tehran. El Al had an office in Tehran. Right? Think about that. It's almost unimaginable today. The enmity between the two countries is driven exclusively by the ideology of the regime. It's also important to remember that when you look at the threats surrounding, the conventional threats surrounding Israel today, whether it's rockets and missiles in Gaza or rockets and missiles in Lebanon, those threats do not exist without Iran. So today, what Hezbollah is doing with Iranian assistance is taking those rockets and missiles and upgrading them, making them so they go from unguided rockets to precision-guided missiles. This is a very, very serious threat. It needs to be taken seriously. I know that Israel does take it seriously, and I think you and I talked about this in an event we did previously. One of the things that I would be concerned about, not as an Israeli, but as a Lebanese, is how many of those rockets and missiles are going to explode in Lebanon in a future round of conflict. These things pose a grave threat to the safety and security of Lebanon as they do to Israel.
Yeah, I'll just say that the PGM threat, these precision-guided munitions, the chief of staff of the Israeli military, Yair CUFI, actually noted that this is the second gravest threat to Israel's security, second only to the Iranian nuclear program. Now, you ask yourself, why? Okay, right now we believe that there are probably only about 400 or 500 of these precision-guided munitions in Hezbollah's hands. That doesn't sound like a lot, except here's the problem, twofold. One is they might be able to evade Iron Dome. We don't know yet, right? They are going to have to be tested probably in the middle of a conflict. And so that's something that I know that Israeli engineers are already working on, but that safety that Israel enjoys, relative safety, it's something like 90% of all those unguided rockets, Iron Dome is able to knock them out of the sky pretty easily, and Israel remains safe. With PGMs, it's an unknown, it's a great unknown. The other thing is you start to blend them, the precision weapons and the unguided weapons. How does Iron Dome know how to differentiate them once they're in the sky? Another engineering problem that I know that there are Israelis that are up late every night thinking about this for when the next conflict comes. But the real challenge with PGMs is that they can hit within about 10 feet of their intended target. So what does that mean? It means that if Hezbollah is keeping a list of the strategic targets that it wants to hit in Israel, the Dimona nuclear facility is one of them, the chemical plant in Haifa, the headquarters of the IDF in Tel Aviv, large office buildings, right? You can begin to see these could be catastrophic events if Hezbollah has its way. Now, the Israelis, as I said, they're working on trying to figure out how to solve this problem. But the real danger is that Israel may need to take the war to Lebanon. And just a moment there, I think it's important to just explain, Lebanon is bankrupt. It's already $130 billion in debt, according to low-end estimates. Now, this is a country of 5 million people with no exports. They are bankrupt because Hezbollah has used the country to launder money for the last 20 years. So they have bankrupted the country. The political system is falling apart. The last thing they need is a war, and the last thing that Israel wants is a war. So this could be the one saving grace, is that we have this crisis brewing, and that maybe, just maybe, we can enlist the help of the United States, of the UN, of the French, or any other country for that matter, to convince the Lebanese to remove those PGMs before Israel does it for them.
Thank you. I don't know about you. I could listen to both of them speak all day, but we have 3 senators who need to go to the Hill to vote. So I want to thank Dr. Schachter, Dr. Schanzer, and really appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And